September 1991. High in the Ötztal Alps, on the border between Austria and Italy, two German hikers spot something dark protruding from melting glacial ice. At first, they assume it's a lost mountaineer, maybe a skier who never made it home. Rescue teams are called, recovery begins, and then the science starts coming back, and every assumption in the room collapses at once. This isn't a modern accident. The body melting out of that glacier is over 5,000 years old, the oldest naturally preserved human ever found intact, so well preserved that scientists could still examine his stomach contents, his last meal, the arrow that killed him. But it's not the age that stuns researchers most. It's what's on his skin. 61 tattoos, sets of parallel lines and small crosses tattooed across his lower back, his knees, his ankles, his wrists. A man from the Copper Age, walking around Bronze Age Europe 5,300 years ago, permanently marked from the waist down. And here's the detail that should stop you cold. Those 61 tattoos aren't randomly placed. When researchers cross-referenced their location against the man's own skeleton, they found degenerative damage, arthritis, joint wear, spinal stress at almost every single site where a tattoo sits. Roughly 80% of them line up with points still used in acupuncture today, a medical tradition historians assume didn't exist anywhere on Earth for another 2,000 years. You've probably been told tattoos are a modern thing. Rebellion, bikers, prisoners, rock stars, a countercultural statement against a clean, buttoned-up society. Almost none of that is true. Tattooing might be one of the oldest continuous technologies in human history, invented independently by unconnected cultures on nearly every continent on Earth, for reasons ranging from medicine to religion to social rank to raw survival. The oldest tattooed human ever discovered wasn't decorating himself. There's a real chance he was trying to heal himself. This is the story of tattoos. And the man at the very beginning of it may have been humanity's first documented patient, 5,000 years before anyone had a word for medicine at all. Picture Ötzi in the final years of his life, sometime around 3,300 BC, somewhere in the Alpine foothills of what would one day become the border of Austria and Italy. He's roughly 45 years old, which for his era makes him something close to elderly. His body, when scientists finally reconstruct it in full, tells a story of chronic, grinding pain, arthritic knees, degeneration along his lumbar spine, whipworm parasites in his intestines, hardened arteries, a stomach infection from Helicobacter pylori bacteria, rotten teeth. This is not a warrior in his prime. This is a man who has spent decades walking mountain terrain on joints that are slowly failing him, in a world with no aspirin, no anti-inflammatory herbs strong enough to fully mask that kind of pain, and no doctor waiting in the next village. And across those exact points of failure, his lower back, his aching knees, the tendons above his heels, someone in his community took a sharp tool, made small incisions in his skin, and rubbed charcoal into the wounds until they scarred into permanent black lines. Modern acupuncturists who've studied the placement independently, without being told what conclusions other researchers had already drawn, have identified the same thing: tattoo clusters sitting directly on or beside classical acupuncture points and meridians still used in East Asian medicine today, thousands of years before the practice's first written description in China. Nobody is claiming Ötzi's community invented acupuncture as we understand it, or that the two traditions are directly connected across 5,000 years and two separate continents. What the tattoos do suggest, though, is something almost more remarkable: that the basic insight behind acupuncture, that puncturing or marking specific points on the body at specific depths can relieve specific kinds of pain, may have been independently discovered by prehistoric Europeans through nothing more than generations of careful, repeated trial and error, passed down exactly the way any hard-won survival knowledge gets passed down before anyone invents writing to record it. Whatever tattooing meant to Ötzi's community beyond that, status, identity, spiritual protection, the evidence sitting on his own joints suggests that somewhere in deep prehistory, marking the skin and treating the body were never fully separate ideas at all. And Ötzi, remarkable as he is, isn't even tattooing's true point of origin. He's simply the oldest example cold enough, dry enough, and lucky enough to survive intact for archaeologists to find. Roughly 2,000 miles south of the Alps, in the Egyptian desert near a site called Gebelein, two naturally mummified bodies had been sitting in a British museum collection since the year 1900, acquired from an excavation and quietly catalogued, their skin darkened with age, their surfaces assumed to hold nothing more than the standard fading and staining of a 5,000-year-old corpse. It took until 2018 for anyone to look closely enough. Using infrared imaging, capable of detecting the specific way carbon-based tattoo ink absorbs light differently than the surrounding skin, researchers discovered that the male mummy, now called Gebelein Man A, carried tattoos of two overlapping horned animals on his upper arm, a wild bull and what's believed to be a Barbary sheep. Faint smudges under ordinary light that resolved, under infrared, into deliberate, confident artwork. The female mummy beside him, Gebelein woman, carried a different set of markings entirely, a vertical series of small S-shaped symbols across her shoulder, and a separate linear design on her arm, closely resembling objects held by figures in ceremonial scenes painted on pottery from the same era. Dated to somewhere between 3,351 and 3,017 BC, these are, as of that 2018 discovery, the oldest known figural, meaning pictorial, image-based tattoos ever found anywhere on Earth, pushing the evidence for African tattooing back an entire additional 1,000 years in a single afternoon of imaging work on bodies that had been sitting in plain sight in a London museum for over a century. Gebelein Man's tattoos, researchers believe, may connect to the very same violent death visible on his own skeleton. A stab wound to the shoulder blade, suggesting he was a hunter or warrior, his tattooed animals possibly serving as badges of bravery or claimed sources of power, imagery meant to be read by other people, not hidden. Gebelein woman's tattoos tell a murkier story, but they establish something just as important on their own. She now holds the title of the oldest confirmed tattooed woman in the archaeological record, evidence that tattooing in ancient Egypt was never confined to one gender or one narrow purpose from its very earliest appearance. That gendered dimension of Egyptian tattooing becomes unmistakable a few centuries later, in one of the most misread archaeological discoveries in the entire history of the practice. In 1891, French Egyptologist Eugène Graybeau uncovered the mummy of a woman named Amunet at Deir el-Bahari, dated to somewhere around 2000 BC, a priestess of the goddess Hathor, her body marked with careful geometric patterns of dots and parallel lines tattooed across her abdomen, thighs, and arms. For decades after her discovery, the male archaeologists who first examined her jumped straight to the least generous available explanation, assuming the markings signaled some kind of sexualized status, and casually labeling a priestess of one of ancient Egypt's most significant temples a concubine, purely on the evidence of ink on her skin. Modern scholarship has since overturned that reading almost entirely. Hathor was the goddess most closely associated with fertility, childbirth, and the protection of women through pregnancy, and Amunet's markings correspond closely with a set of small tattooed faience figurines found buried in Middle Kingdom tombs, specifically to safeguard the dead in the afterlife. Read in that fuller context, Amunet's tattoos look far less like a mark of shame, and far more like a form of protective, devotional body art, a permanent prayer, worn on the skin of a woman whose entire religious role centered on guarding new life through one of the most physically dangerous experiences a person in the ancient world could survive. Excavations at Deir el-Medina, the village where the artisans who carved and painted the Valley of the Kings actually lived, later turned up an even richer, more varied picture. Beginning in 2017, using the same infrared imaging technique that revealed the Gebelein tattoos, bioarchaeologist Ann Austin identified tattoos on multiple mummified individuals from this working-class New Kingdom community, men and women alike, including designs never documented on an Egyptian body before. The protective eye of Horus, seated deities, lotus flowers inked directly onto the neck, a placement with no known precedent anywhere else in the archaeological record. What emerges from Gebelein, from Amunet, and from Deir el-Medina together isn't a single simple explanation for why ancient Egyptians tattooed themselves. It's a layered, evolving tradition, protection, devotion, status, and personal identity, all coexisting on the same skin across more than 1,000 years of continuous practice. Nearly 3,000 miles northeast of Egypt, in the frozen Altai Mountains of Siberia, an entirely different culture was independently developing one of the most technically sophisticated tattoo traditions the ancient world ever produced, and doing so with no possible knowledge that Egyptians or alpine hunters had ever picked up a needle at all. The Pazyryk people, part of the broader nomadic Scythian world, buried their dead in deep earthen mounds called kurgans between roughly the 6th and 2nd centuries BC. In the brutal cold of the Altai, groundwater seeping into those tombs would freeze solid and stay frozen for over 2,000 years, encasing the bodies inside in a natural deep freeze that preserved not just bone, but skin, hair, and, remarkably, ink. 7 tattooed Pazyryk mummies have been recovered so far, their skin darkened by 2 millennia of mummification, to the point that early excavators initially missed the tattoos entirely, mistaking the discoloration for ordinary decay. It took modern near-infrared imaging and 3D digital reconstruction, published as recently as 2025, to finally reveal what was hiding underneath that darkened skin. Extraordinarily elaborate, full-color in-spirit compositions of coiling predatory cats locked in combat with deer and elk, birds with elongated tails, fantastical composite creatures blending multiple animals into a single continuous design, wrapping around entire forearms and shoulders. Picture one of the Pazyryk women recovered from these frozen tombs, her forearm marked with tigers, stags, and a leopard all twisted together in motion, a bird traced delicately across the back of her hand. Researchers studying the fine detail of her markings found something that upended a long-standing assumption about how ancient tattooing actually worked: subtle stylistic differences between different tattoos on the same body, suggesting the work of 2 separate artists, or the same artist returning at a different stage of their own training. Clear evidence that tattooing among the Pazyryk wasn't an improvised folk custom passed casually from neighbor to neighbor, but a genuine specialized craft requiring real technical training and apprenticeship, practiced by dedicated artisans skilled enough to be recognized and presumably compensated for their individual style. Halfway around the ancient world from Egypt, with zero possibility of contact or influence, an entirely separate culture had independently arrived at tattooing as a serious, respected artistic profession. For all of these ancient cultures, alpine hunters, Egyptian priestesses, Siberian horse warriors, tattooing carried weight, meaning sometimes even sacredness. But almost simultaneously, a very different use for the exact same technology was taking root in the classical Mediterranean world, one built not around honor, but around control. In ancient Greece, and even more extensively in Rome, tattoos were routinely forced onto slaves and criminals as a permanent, unremovable form of identification. The Greek word for this practice, stigma, is the same word English still uses today for social shame, a linguistic fossil of exactly how those marks were meant to function. A surviving legal inscription from the city of Ephesus records that slaves exported into the province of Asia were tattooed with the blunt words "tax paid," branded like inventory. Other Roman slaves carried a still harsher message inked across their foreheads: "Stop me, I'm a runaway," a permanent warning intended to strip a captured person of any hope of blending back into free society. Roman soldiers, too, were tattooed, practical unit markings on the wrist and forearm meant to identify their legion and discourage desertion, a use of the technology that was functional rather than punitive, closer to a military dog tag than a badge of shame. That association between tattoos and punishment reached its most brutal expression under the Emperor Caligula, who reportedly had tattoos forcibly applied to young Roman nobles before condemning them to slavery, and who extended punitive tattooing to early Christians as well, marking some believers with crucifixes as a mocking, permanent inscription of their faith on their own skin before sending them to labor in the mines. When Christianity itself became the empire's dominant religion under Constantine, the emperor moved, around 315 to 330 AD, depending on the source, to ban the tattooing of faces specifically, not out of any newfound respect for bodily autonomy, but because Constantine held that the human face had been made in the literal image of God, and permanently marking it was, in his reasoning, an act of disfiguring the divine. Tattooing on other parts of the body continued for a while longer, hands and calves absorbing the punitive marks the face was no longer permitted to carry, until the Second Council of Nicaea formally condemned the entire practice outright in 787 AD. For the better part of the next 1,000 years, in the eyes of the institutional Christian church across most of Europe, a tattoo was, almost by definition, a mark of shame, sin, or subjugation, an association so deeply embedded that it would take a set of accidental encounters on the other side of the planet to finally begin unraveling it. That unraveling begins in July 1769 on the island of Tahiti, when Captain James Cook's ship, the HMS Endeavour, drops anchor as part of Cook's first Great Pacific voyage. Aboard is Joseph Banks, a young naturalist who will go on to become one of the most influential scientific figures of his era. And it's Banks who first puts into writing something no European language had ever quite had a word for. Watching Tahitians mark their own skin with elaborate permanent designs, Banks records in his journal, "I shall now mention the way they mark themselves indelibly. Each of them is so marked by their humor or disposition." Cook himself, describing the same practice in his own log, reaches for the Tahitian word he's hearing used for it, tatau, his best attempt at spelling the Polynesian term tatau. Linguists studying the word today believe it may be onomatopoeic in origin, tat, echoing the tapping sound of a bone or shell comb being struck with a small mallet to drive pigment beneath the skin, and some scholars suggest, echoing the cry of the person receiving it. Within 2 years, Cook's published account of the voyage introduces this word to English readers for the first time in print, and Europe finally has language for a practice its own church had spent 1,000 years trying to erase entirely from memory. The moment that truly ignites European fascination, though, isn't a word in a journal, it's a person. In 1774, Cook's expedition brings a young Tahitian man named Mai, anglicized in Britain to Omai, back to London, his arms and back marked with intricate black Polynesian designs. Omai becomes an instant sensation in London high society, introduced personally to King George III, escorted to the state opening of Parliament by Joseph Banks himself, painted in a now famous portrait by Sir Joshua Reynolds that would later sell at auction for over £10 million. To a British public raised entirely on the association between tattoos and criminality, slavery, and disgrace, Omai's markings register instead as something almost impossible to reconcile with everything they thought they knew. Dignified, deliberate, clearly the product of real artistry rather than punishment. British sailors serving under Cook, watching Polynesian tattooing firsthand across multiple Pacific voyages, begin returning home with tattoos of their own. And by the early 19th century, a tattooed sailor has become one of the most recognizable and, gradually, most romanticized figures in the entire British and American maritime world. Proof of a voyage completed, a way of marking survival on a body that had crossed oceans most people back home would never see. While Polynesian contact was slowly reshaping European attitudes on one side of the world, an entirely parallel and far darker transformation was unfolding in Japan. Tattooing as criminal punishment had existed in Japan in scattered form for well over 1,000 years, but it became formal state policy in 1720 when the 8th Tokugawa shogun, Yoshimune, made punitive tattooing an official replacement for older, more mutilating punishments like the amputation of a thief's nose or ears. Different regions developed their own specific tattoo codes so that any local official could read a stranger's criminal history at a glance. An armband here, a forehead mark there, some domains reportedly stacking a single stroke of a specific character onto a criminal's arm for each successive offense, until repeated crimes literally completed an entire written word branded permanently into the skin. It was, in effect, a legible criminal record a person could never take off, never hide from a new town, never outrun. And it's out of that very system of permanent public shame that Japan's celebrated tattoo art form was actually born. As punitive tattooing gradually declined toward the end of the 17th century, former convicts began doing something ingenious, covering their government-issued brands with larger, more elaborate decorative designs, transforming a mark of disgrace into camouflage, and camouflage over time into genuine artistry. That transformation accelerated dramatically in the late 1820s when a wildly popular series of woodblock prints by the artist Utagawa Kuniyoshi, illustrating tattooed outlaw heroes from the Chinese novel Suikoden, swept through Edo period Japan and inspired an entire generation of ordinary people to commission similarly bold, narrative-driven body art for themselves. No criminal record required. This new decorative tradition, called irezumi, would go on to be adopted by Japan's emerging organized crime networks, the Yakuza, who embraced full-body tattooing as a grueling, painful initiation ritual, proof of loyalty, and an ability to endure suffering for the group. The style was deliberately engineered to stay hidden, covering the arms, chest, back, and thighs, but stopping short at the neck, wrists, and ankles, so a fully tattooed Yakuza member could still wear an ordinary kimono in public and reveal nothing at all. Imperial Japan formally banned tattooing altogether during the Meiji era in an effort to present a more civilized face to Western powers, a ban that held until the American occupation lifted it after the Second World War. But the underworld association it had cemented over 2 centuries never fully faded, which is why, even today, most Japanese hot springs and public bathhouses still turn away visibly tattooed guests on site. Back in the West, through the 19th and early 20th centuries, tattoos settled into an uneasy dual identity that would define public perception for the next 100 years. Simultaneously, a mark of the maritime working class, sailors, dock workers, and later soldiers wearing anchors, ships, and sweethearts' names as private records of a hard life at sea, and a carnival spectacle with heavily tattooed men and women touring as sideshow attractions, their skin turned into paid entertainment for audiences who would never have considered getting a tattoo themselves. That second reputation, tattoos as something belonging to sailors, criminals, and circus performers rather than ordinary respectable citizens, hardened through most of the 20th century into genuine, widespread stigma, particularly in the United States, where visible tattoos could cost a person a job interview, a promotion, or a place in polite society well into the 1990s. The turn away from that stigma, when it finally came, arrived less as a single moment and more as a slow cultural tide, improved, safer tattoo machines and sterilization standards through the late 20th century, a wave of professional athletes and musicians wearing visible tattoos on television and magazine covers through the 1990s and 2000s, and reality television in the mid-2000s turning celebrity tattoo artists into household names, walking the practice back, step by step, from society's margins toward its mainstream center. Today, tattooing sits in one of the strangest positions of its entire 5,000-year history. Broadly legal, broadly destigmatized across most of the Western world, practiced by a meaningful share of the adult population in country after country, and yet still carrying, in Japan and in scattered pockets elsewhere, the exact same institutional suspicion Constantine encoded into Roman law 17 centuries ago. And in an odd, quiet way, the story has circled back almost exactly to where it began, up in that melting alpine glacier. Modern tattoo artists, studying medicinal and spiritual tattoo traditions from around the world, have begun deliberately reviving ancient hand-tapped and hand-poked techniques once thought lost entirely, working directly from the placement and pattern logic visible on bodies like Ötzi's own. Meanwhile, actual medical researchers, working completely independently, continue to study whether Ötzi's tattoos really do represent an early, forgotten form of pain management therapy, a question science has still not fully closed, more than 3 decades after 2 hikers first spotted something dark in the ice. So the next time you see a tattoo on a stranger's forearm, a sailor's memory of a voyage, a Japanese backpiece hidden under a business shirt, or a small, ordinary design chosen simply because it meant something to somebody, remember what's actually being carried on that skin. A 5,000-year-old technology invented independently by hunters in the Alps, priestesses on the Nile, and horse warriors in Siberian permafrost, weaponized for 1,000 years as a tool of shame and ownership, smuggled back into respectability by a single tattooed man from Tahiti standing in front of the King of England, and only now, after 5 millennia, finally returning to something close to what it may have first been for a dying arthritic man in the Copper Age. Not rebellion, not decoration, not disgrace, but one of the oldest, most human attempts on record to take control of a body that hurts and mark it anyway.